What is up, everybody? I'm NoLucksGiven here with your afternoon snap. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the top 8 of this week's community gaming tournament, the first of the season. And we have already got some new cards. We're going to see some decks with Agent Venom, a deck with Scream, and a deck that beat both of those decks to win the entire tournament. But we're gonna make our way up to that. We are gonna start with our 8th place list from Vendread, and we're gonna work our way up to 1st place. But Vendread was playing Arishem, and there's some interesting stuff here to consider with Arishem. The first of which that I noticed is no Loki in this Arishem list, and honestly, I don't hate it. Since the nerf to Loki, being a 2-2 is definitely a little bit of a drawback, but more so not drawing a card on this version of Loki, meaning that you have to draw all of the Loki cards out of your deck one at a time, can feel a little bit slow. It's certainly better than playing a bunch of random cards from Arishem, but it's not really worth playing the 2-2. And in this version of Arishem, Vendread has just said, I'm just going to load up on a bunch of tech cards and make every slot that I have impactful in a way that Loki really isn't. I don't just want to play a bad copy of my opponent's deck. I want to play a cool Arishem deck, and that is what we are looking at here with a bunch of tech that we have mostly seen before in Arishem decks, and one card that we haven't really seen before. Annihilus makes its way into this list. Now, viewers of this channel might remember when Junk was popular a little bit ago, probably 2-3 months ago, I suggested putting Cersei in your Annihilus list. Now, I still think Cersei is a pretty cool Annihilus card. It allows you to get value out of those random cards that Annihilus gives you if there's some junk that you want to get rid of in a typical game, but it's not going to be good at It's not going to be as good at getting rid of junk as Annihilus is. Annihilus is just the king of getting rid of junk, basically clears it all except for rocks, and Annihilus may not also clear out Widow's Bites in your full locations, or Widow's Kisses. Widow's Kisses, Widow's Bites, the one that White Widow gives you, whichever one that is. And so that is one sort of downside to Annihilus, but the upside of Annihilus as opposed to Cersei is you can have your locations, you can have some locations totally full, totally junked out, like with that Widow card and whatever that is, and that means that Annihilus is like a little bit more flexible against some of these junks because they're looking to junk you out on turn 3 sometimes, usually turn 4. That's when they play a 3-cost card alongside a Titania, and that is the same turn that you can play Cersei, but you're not always going to draw your Annihilus or Cersei by turn 4 when you're playing Annihilus. When you're playing Arishem, I mean. So Annihilus just gives you a little bit more flexibility in your curve. Killmonger is also here to clear up some junks that can get rid of some rocks, though it's also here to be an answer to things like Human Torch. And then there is a bunch of other tech here. We've got the Shang-Chi and Enchantress, Cosmo, Legion. Cosmo and Alioth we have seen in conjunction recently in some move decks, and they're pretty good together at stopping Hela decks. And Arishem is another archetype that can often have priority going into that final turn of the game. So you've got Cosmo in one location, now Alioth just has to win a 50-50, which is pretty good. And sometimes you can also just have Cosmo come down on the final turn and surprise your opponent that way, though that's a little bit harder to manage Also, Legion, I did mention that briefly, but Legion is just really good at stealing games, and it is one card that I am always sad when I don't have it in my Arishem list, and it's one card that I'm always happy to draw just because of its ability to win games and impact locations. I do think you want at least one card that can impact locations in some capacity, and that's a very broad definition that I'm saying there, because I would include something like Vision in that, just like able to get into Sanctum Sanctorum or some other weird locations that might come up. But Legion probably being the best among those cards because it can just straight up win games that other cards cannot. So huge shout outs to Legion here and Vendread for getting 8th place with Loki-less Arishem. On to 7th place, we have our first of 3 appearances of Agent Venom. And I'm not going to break down this list here from Punk Papow too much because we're going to see another bounce Agent Venom list that did pretty well. But I do want to touch on some cards here. So the main card that Agent Venom, and if you are not familiar with it, it's the new Season Pass card. On reveal, set the power of all cards in your deck to 4. It is probably the first thing that I think that most people pair it up with is the Hood, which it gives +7 power to, which seems like it is going to be the most power that you could get out of Agent Venom, aside from putting it on Hobgoblin, which wouldn't really work. That would be like -12 power on Hobgoblin. But there's actually a card that works better with Agent Venom, and I wanted to draw some special attention to it because it's not in the other list that we're going to look at later on in this video, but that's Mysterio. So Mysterio makes 2 0 power clones. However, if you are able to Agent Venom your Mysterio, those clones will actually be 4 power. Mysterio will also be 4 power, so the clone aspect of it won't really matter, but it's still +8 power on the board because you're getting 4 power out of each of those clones that you wouldn't otherwise. So that is a really, really powerful interaction to look at, I think, going forward. And the rest of the deck just plays a bunch of other cards that really get all of their power from their on reveal, or in the case of Black Swan now in activate, but every other card in the deck list is an on reveal card. And yeah, speaking of Black Swan, that has not seen some play. Oh, I have to mention this. This is just a bug with SnapFan, which was the easiest thing for me to put these decks together, put these graphics together quickly. But Black Swan is, of course, a 2/3 with Activate. It just hasn't been updated on this website. So apologies if that's a little bit confusing here on the screen. But Black Swan now seeing some play as an Activate card in these Agent Venom bounce lists. And yeah, this being an Activate, switching it over to an Activate card was the push that it needed to get it over the edge. And this deck looks pretty powerful. It's interesting with Agent Venom, and I think that bounce is like always a pretty powerful deck. So Agent Venom is just kind of having people revisit the archetype, but it adds an interesting element into these bounce decks because in the past, I would say bounce decks are pretty straightforward. They are tricky to play, but they're straightforward in that the order that you draw your cards doesn't have as high of an impact, or didn't have as high of an impact as it does now. And there are certainly some cards in bounce decks that you want to draw early and some that you want to draw late. Bast was a card similar to Agent Venom that this deck has played in the past, and that has kind of a similar role, though a little bit more flexibility. Basically, Agent Venom, no secret, you want to play that as early as possible so that you can draw more cards that Agent Venom has been able to pump up, and you want to draw your Hood and your Mysterio, for instance, after you have drawn Agent Venom. Now, how this actually comes into play with the snap mechanic, I think is really interesting because, for one, it gives you higher variance, which I think is a strong thing when you are playing cards like Okoye or Fastos, cards that reward you for drawing them and give you more ability to snap and apply pressure to your opponents. I think that that can all be very good. One of the other things that this deck does is sort of like a Mr. Negative impression, though, too, in that your opponent doesn't actually know what you drew before Agent Venom and what you drew after Agent Venom. So you could have a lot of secret value on that final turn, not as much with the Hood, which you'll want to play before the final turn of the game, but certainly with Mysterio's ability to come down on the final turn for a surprising amount of points. If your opponent just isn't expecting it, and it's just 4 power into each location, it's pumping up the Hit Monkey, plus you've got some free 1-cost cards that you can throw down as well. All of that seems pretty strong, and in a way that your opponent kind of has to respect and be fearful of. Agent Venom gonna put the fear into some people, definitely on flavor there, and like I said, we're gonna talk more about this deck in a moment, but there's another deck that is playing Agent Venom that we also have to discuss. This is Mike Ehrmantraut's 6th place. Yeah, they got 6th place in the event with Blue Zoo, with Agent Venom included. And most of these cards, as you can see, are benefited from Agent Venom. And this is a bold choice as well to have a huge over-the-top grow tall finisher in the form of Gilgamesh that gets shrunk by Agent Venom. However, if you are able to pump up some other cards with your Agent Venom, then you're potentially making Gilgamesh even bigger. So a little bit of risk reward there, and also sort of plays into what I was just talking about. Does your opponent have to play around a 4-power Gilgamesh, or do they have to play around a 9-power Gilgamesh on the final turn and get all of those other benefits? So definitely a little bit more, I will say, of a risk reward that it's kind of like in deck building, but also in snapping. And I think that that's just going to remain just something that makes Marvel Snap awesome and fun, is that you can play cards that are higher variance and kind of mitigate that variance with the betting mechanic in the game. So this deck is pretty straightforward, I have to say. And I don't really think I've got too much more to add other than that. Just cool to see people already experimenting with Agent Venom. It's like playing like Odin in your Mr. Negative deck, or I mean, like Jane Foster gets played in the Mr. Negative decks, but that one, Jane Foster's an awkward one, because if you Mr. Negative and then you draw the Jane Foster, then Jane is like basically not playable. She becomes a 6/5, so you can't play her until the final turn, at which point it's useless. Gilgamesh doesn't quite get that nerfed here, but it loses 5 power, and that's definitely going to be relevant in some games. So there might be some times where you don't play Agent Venom on turn 2 or something. Like, this deck might want to wait until it can draw the Gilgamesh before it plays the Agent Venom, or you might just play the Agent Venom on turn 2, hope that you don't draw Gilgamesh or bluff and all of those other things. So really interesting to just see some players innovating with Agent Venom already. Again, these tournaments are played when the cards are not even 24 hours old, and it's cool to see some interesting lines that the players come up with, even if Blue Zoo is a pretty stock list, pretty straightforward list, I will say. Like, it's not super complicated, all of the stuff that's going on here. We still see some interesting innovation in the form of the newest season pass card. And then we have a pretty classic deck here, I would say, that has received one notable upgrade recently in the form of Moon Knight, getting only discarding even cost cards now But this is not, don't get fooled, this is not a Moon Knight Midnight deck. This is classic Apocalypse discard with MODOK and all of the other cards that make you discard. Interestingly, Moon Knight can miss in this deck. It can discard Morbius, it can discard Dracula, and it can discard Colleen Wing potentially sometimes. So all of those things are, definitely some things to look out for. And this is the other interesting thing that I wanted to bring up with this deck is that it is not playing Black Bolt. It is not playing Silver Samurai. So the only way to make your stature cheaper is with Moon Knight, or potentially Sokovia, or potentially also if you were playing up against Hela. That will also make your stature cheaper. I'm not sure if it's going to make you competitive necessarily against a Hela deck, but this list was competitive enough to get 5th place in this tournament from Sharuru. So huge shout out to them with basically a classic deck list, I would say. I do think that this deck is going to get a lot better once we get Scorn, I believe, is the new card releasing this month for this archetype. That'll more or less slot right into this deck. And until then, I think this is an interesting deck list to play, and apparently still able to get it done. And I think like some of the missing piece here is stature just getting played along with this Moon Knight. Moon Knight, I think, is doing heavy lifting in a lot of capacities in this deck, I will say, because it, along with Gambit, is really the deck's only interaction. Moon Knight makes them discard a card, and Gambit can destroy a random card from your opponents. But Gambit is not something that you can rely on hitting a key card, and so Moon Knight really becomes this deck's main interaction, and I think it will probably become a YouTube short. I don't have it together to like go live today. I've got a little bit of a backlog in my YouTube shorts right now, so it'll probably come out like early next week, maybe, probably sometime next week. I played a game and Cloning Vats was one of the locations, and I realized I was up against Hela. So I played my Moon Knight into Cloning Vats every single turn, and my third Moon Knight got their Hela, which was just a really satisfying feeling. With just one Moon Knight, it's a little bit tricky, but maybe you could delay it and play Moon Knight on turn 5 and hope to get a little bit luckier with it. This deck does seem like it potentially wants to be playing Moon Knight on turn 5, trying to get your opponent's 6-cost card, because you really don't want to Moon Knight and discard your Dracula. That's like one of the most important cards in the deck, just allowing you to play that Apocalypse for a little bit cheaper and a little bit bigger. So playing Moon Knight on turn 5 makes sense in that capacity as well, just because then you don't risk discarding Dracula, which I think is more or less the card that this deck is built around. I think that it's definitely the most powerful card in the deck, just being the power plus the cheat. But here we go. Basic Apocalypse Dracula discard, getting it done, getting a 5th place finish. And now on to the top 4, we have Hela. And this is very much a known deck list at this point. This is card for card the 12 cards that you're going to expect in any Hela deck that you come across. Except maybe the Colleen Wing. Sometimes seeing, that's interesting. Colleen Wing, maybe not exactly what I'm expecting. Sometimes you'll see like Lady Sif and Death in addition to the bigger cards in the deck, like Cutting Giganto for Death, so that way Lady Sif always hits that, and then all of your discard is targeted. In this case, Colleen Wing, I think I have seen this in some lists though before as well. She's trying to hit either the Luke Cage, the Jubilee, or the Blink without any risk of discarding Hela. And then if you play a turn 5 Jubilee into a turn 6 Hela. Hela gets to reanimate the Blink and blink away the Jubilee, which is part of like your biggest high roll. And so that's possibly why Colleen Wing is in this iteration of the deck. I have not actually played Hela decks in a while myself, to be honest. And I'll definitely revisit them at some point just to get it under my belt so I can better talk about them. But I think everybody knows basically what's going on with Hela decks at this point. And interestingly, the way that the bracket worked out here, Hela lost to both Scream and Agent Venom in the top 4. And first, we're going to look at our third place list, which was Scream. And this list comes from, I should say Root Record got 4th with Hela, and Rage It got 3rd place with Scream. And that is one other awkward thing about the Snap Fan presentation here. I'm unable to put the players' names on the screen super easily. So I just try to mention all of their names just to give all of these players the credit and their kudos. But this was Rage It's 3rd place Scream deck, and I don't know if the community already has a name for these Scream decks, but I would like to submit the name Roller Coaster, because you're whipping, you're moving all of your opponent's cards every which way, and they're screaming. I think that's cool. I don't know. Maybe people are just going to call these Scream decks, but I think that would be a fitting name for them. So here we've got Rage It's Roller Coaster list, and this is, I will say, I thought, like, this is obviously what people were going to do with Scream, right? Sorry, I've got a hair in my mouth just trying to grab that, but I think that Scream decks aren't surprising, the list. You play Scream, you play Kingpin, then you play every card that can make your opponent's cards move, and a little bit of tech thrown in here because you can't quite fill out the deck with just those other cards. So we've got, and Kraven too, but we've got Red Guardian and Legion as the tech, and then everything else basically moves your opponent's cards around or is Miles Morales. I don't think that part's surprising. What is surprising is this deck getting 3rd place in a tournament the first day of the new season. That really surprised me. I did not think that this deck was going to be good. One thought that I have had about this Scream deck and the cards in it is many of these cards are very playable or close to being playable without Scream. There wasn't really that much incentive for playing all of them together other than like Kraven and Kingpin, which weren't that great, but you throw Scream in there, you throw an additional 4 points of power, -2 from your opponent, +2 on Scream, for every single one of these cards that are either cards that have been playable at one point or cards that Marvel Snap just recently buffed. They just buffed Arrow and Stegron in, I believe, the past season, and Kingpin was buffed either a season or 2 ago, but either way, like, all of the other cards I think could see play, and then the ones that couldn't, they buffed kind of in preparation for Scream, probably, and I think that all of that actually did enough work that this is a pretty solid deck list, and it's something that I did not expect to see, definitely underestimated a little bit, but I'm excited about, especially like as a free-to-play player. This is a pretty good deck to, and Scream is a pretty good card to like recommend, because I think a lot of this other stuff you can pick up fairly cheaply. Let me see. So series 3, 444. Yeah, it's really just Cannonball, right? And then Red Guardian, but that's tech. You can swap that out for anything else that I don't really think you want to play Cosmo, but there's a number of other cards that you could replace Red Guardian with. It doesn't move. It does have the word move on it because it says remove. So if you search up move, Red Guardian will pop up. That might be how Rageit came up with putting Red Guardian in their deck. But regardless there, I think that this is a powerful deck list that is fairly cheap to put together. So yeah, huge shout outs here to Rageit's Roller Coaster with Scream. But we do also have an Agent Venom deck list in this top 2. I brought this up previously, and this was the second placed list in the tournament. This was played by Nathiel, a name that you probably recognize from winning some previous tournaments. And again, we have Agent Venom bounce, a slightly different list. As a reminder, this was the other list, and these are the cards that made our second place list. So a few overlaps in cards here. We've got the Hood still, and some others. I won't name every card, but I will talk about the differences here, actually. So Nico is an interesting card because you can double up Nico's power with one of the spells. So if you were able to get Nico Agent Venomized and then double it, you've got an 8 power Nico, so that is definitely something to look forward to. And one card that's, so I'm just going in order across here. Shadow King, very, very interesting in a deck that derives all of its power from additional like stats from on reveals, not ongoing abilities. Shadow King is good against every single card in this deck, other than like the demon from the Hood. And otherwise, Shadow King is a very, very interesting card that I think is a skill tester and is a good demonstration of a good player putting a card in their deck with a specific purpose and knowing how to play that card, because I think a lot of other players would be afraid to put Shadow King in their bounce decks here. But there are some ways to definitely make it work, especially if you're Hitmonkeying with a Black Swan activation on the final turn. You play Hitmonkey in one location, you Shadow King another location, you drop a bunch of 1-cost cards, and you win those 2 locations from the Hitmonkey and the Shadow King respectively. I think that that's a pretty common line. This deck also has some other huge payoff cards here. Werewolf by Night, I mentioned all of the cards in this deck are on reveal. Werewolf by Night not an on reveal itself, but gets a huge benefit from playing a deck chock full of on reveal. So Werewolf by Night, definitely an inclusion that makes a lot of sense. I've also seen Bishop in some Agent Venom decks just because it is a card that benefits from playing a bunch of cards and also gets a little bit of extra power from that Agent Venom. But Sage gets more power from Agent Venom. She starts as a 3/0, so she gets a +4 from that. And so I have a confession to make with Sage. I read Sage when she came out, and I'm sure I did an evaluation at some point, and I decided not to get her. And she wasn't as good when she first came out, in my opinion. I didn't fully realize, because she came out, I think, right before White Widow came out, and I didn't realize how good she was going to be with White Widow. And also, I totally misread her. I have thought until this week, when I played a Sage, I was playing a Mr. Negative Sage deck, I thought she gave +2 power for each different cost among all other cards at the location. I just found out she said +2 power for each different power, like a few days ago. So yeah, that was really awkward, and that is like the only time that has happened to me in Marvel Snap. Sometimes I have to like reread Iron Fist and remember, oh, is that card going left or right? Like some stuff like that. But yeah, Sage, I just totally have been misreading for like, I don't know, 5 months or something at this point. And I finally played her because I got her out of Spotlight Caches last season. And she didn't do what I thought she was going to do one game. And so I reread her and I was like, oh, okay. Gotcha. But yeah, Sage gets to make play in this deck. Now, interestingly, counting a bunch of different powered cards, kind of weird with Agent Venom. So I'm not totally sold on Sage considering that is what she does. But yeah, I will put it, I will just say Nithiel probably knows better than I do. And kind of, yeah, same comments on the Shadow King thing, but I also just don't even know what Sage does. So yeah, take all that with a grain of salt. And moving on to our first place deck list. And the way that this bracket was set up, this deck list beat obviously Agent Venom in the finals. It also beat this roller coaster list in the semifinals. But the list that actually took the event is just classic junk. There's no Affliction, you might notice, in the top 8 that I am covering, and Affliction is kind of what kept junk at bay. Last week, there were 2 Afflictions in the top 8. This time, no Afflictions, and junk is going to reign supreme. And this is a pretty classic junk list. No Kate Bishop. I think that that is really noteworthy. And we also have the inclusion of Magic and Red Hulk. Something that we have seen people doing, I think, like on the ladder, but this was a combination that did terribly in last week's tournament. And also notably absent from this top 8, any Nocturne. No Nocturne coming out here. So maybe this was able to capitalize a little bit on that way. Nocturne, a great card, by the way, just against clog decks in general, because you can't clog a location where there's a move card, and also it gives you the ability to turn off Magic's Limbo. So without the Nocturne presence and without the presence of Affliction, we see a classic clog deck just get it done. And this is one other thing that I've been seeing from some clog decks recently. Shadow King, Shang-Chi, Cannonball. All 3. Just all of this powerful tech, all of this is like the new Serra deck in a way, where you just play all of these answers to whatever your opponent is trying to do, except you have to commit a decent portion of your deck to answering things like Hela specifically, and in some capacities like Mr. Negative a little bit gets answered by some of this junk. So you're playing all of that to answer Hela, and then Magic allows you to do some really powerful final turns with like Cannonball plus Shadow King, or even just Shadow King plus Shang-Chi sans the Limbo. All of that is just really powerful, and at the end of the day, this is kind of a control deck with Shadow King, Shang-Chi, and Cannonball. It can also just lock an opponent out of a location and then go totally over the top with a Red Hulk, where your opponent is unable to spend all of their energy because they don't have any room left in any location. So I think that all of this is really good. Kitty Pryde is also good in the junk mirrors for sure, because I think if you think junk is good enough, you want to respect that. What do you do if your opponent is playing junk? Kitty Pryde is a pretty good anti-junk card, anti-clog card, and also Debris makes its way into this list. This is not, they are not trying to like hazmat this Debris and send it over with Annihilus and do anything crazy. They're just playing it as another 3-cost card. So typically the curve with this deck, you really want to get that turn 2 White Widow, especially into a location where your opponent has already played a card, and then on turn 3, you want to play either Viper, Green Goblin, or Debris, with turn 4 playing another copy of that card, and all of these are on reveal abilities. And then you actually don't want to play Debris on turn 4, but you want to play Viper or Green Goblin on turn 4 after playing a Titania on that location. That'll usually lock your opponent out of one location, and then you just have to make sure you win the other location. You've got Shadow King, Shang-Chi, and Cannonball to do it. You also have Dr. Octopus, and you also have Red Hulk. So this deck is definitely still strong, but very interesting that this list performed terribly in last week's event. This week, it was able to capitalize on the metagame, and let's take a look at that metagame right now. I will leave a link to this spreadsheet in the video description, and in this, you can find every deck list from all of the 50 or so players in this event, and except one player that registered an 11 card Spectrum Destroyer list. I didn't want to guess what their final card was, so I just cut it from this list. But everything beyond the top 8 is just alphabetized, and then these are our top 8 competitors right here. In addition to all of the deck lists, I've also done a bit of a breakdown, and let me scroll up here. Here we can, I did not sort this data or really go through it at all before pressing record, but surprisingly, wow, you're getting a live reaction here. The Hood was the most played card in this tournament for the first time ever, I have to imagine. Wow, yeah, the Hood. So the Hood getting played in all of the junk decks, all of the Agent Venom decks. I guess not all of the junk decks. It wasn't in the junk deck that won the tournament, but some of the junk Viper decks, the Annihilus ones especially, all of the Agent Venom decks, and then all of the non-Agent Venom bounce decks, I'm sure the Hood would make it into. What else was the Hood good in, I wonder? Well, you can take a look. If you're curious, head over to the player data sheet and you can look at every single deck that contained the Hood. We can see all of these junk cards. Oh, right. No, I guess it isn't really played in Destroy decks anymore. I just saw Nico and thought of Destroy for a second. But, yeah, what else? We've got basically a a clog list up at the top for the most part. Where's Kate Bishop at? Yeah, she's right here. She's pretty heavily played. And then we can also look at, let's look at this. So we can look at, this is the how well the cards performed, or how many top 8 appearances every single card had. And then this basically is how well they did comparatively. Like 25% of the top 8 decks were playing Hawkeye, even though only, there were 2 Hawkeyes in the entire tournament. And yeah, same thing with Colleen Wing. So Hawkeye, not a lot of people are respecting Hawkeye apparently, but 100% top 8 rate for players playing Hawkeye. So that is definitely noteworthy, and we also see pretty good performances from a lot of Agent Venom cards, including Agent Venom himself. We saw 3 in the top 8. I assume there were a lot of players playing it. There were 9. That's a reasonable portion of the metagame, less than 1/5, but slightly highly rated results. So even with this many players playing Agent Venom, it was still potentially underrepresented in this tournament for how good it was. So I think that that's always interesting to look at. Similarly, we can take a look at some of the stinkers here and see what did not do well. Well, White Widow didn't do well despite winning the tournament. There was only 1 in the top 8. It's hard to say it didn't do well though, right? White Widow, Viper, Green Goblin. This does paint an interesting picture though. Yes, one player won the entire tournament with junk, but there were a lot of players trying to play junk in this event, and only one of them came out on top. So, yeah, that's pretty interesting when something like that happens, because it means that junk is both. I mean, the win rate of junk in this event, clog, whatever you want to call it, was not good, but it did win the event. So, I don't know. Does that make it? I mean, it's still obviously a pretty great deck. One thing that I was also really curious about is how absent is Affliction. 3 players only playing Affliction after it put 2 people in the top 8 last week and won the tournament last week. Only 2 players willing to show up with Affliction. Feels like if some more players were playing Affliction, they could have capitalized on all of the clog players and somebody could have come out on top. But I suppose Affliction is not necessarily what you want to go for into like these bounce decks and things, and also not super great into the Hela decks. We did see a Hela deck and a non-Hela discard deck. It's not really the same, but both of those made it into the top 8, so maybe those things kind of kept players from wanting to play Affliction. Interestingly, Scream is an Affliction card, so if somebody starts screaming at you, you can just say, you know, I got Ajax, I don't care. So that is some interesting things to boot here as well, and I will leave this in the video description, like I said, and I will remember to make it public this time so everyone can check it out, and let me know if you find anything cool in here. But for today, I'm gonna call it there. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm NoLucksGiven. Peace.